I'm gonna go ahead and apologize in advance because I know my computer's been making strange buzzing sounds lately, and I'm pretty sure it has something to do with it being so cold. So I just want to get that out of the way in case people hear that in the video. I'm feeling a little more focused and concentrated for once, so I thought I'd make a video about something that's relatively important to me. As you guys have probably seen in previous videos I've put up, that my operating system on full display. You've seen either the desktop of Linux Mint, maybe occasionally Windows, or Debian, which is what I'm using right now. I'm still using Debian, but I actually came really close to accidentally deleting it, being silly and modifying system files because some things broke while I was trying to modify the system. And that brought me to the idea of something I've wanted to make a video on for at least the last few months, maybe since the last year. Here are some tips I have to give to people that are going with an unusual computer setup like I did, because I am an imperfect person who makes snap decisions without thinking things out. Um, if you do something strange, like you realize you need Windows for certain things because the Linux emulation just isn't good enough, or there are programs that just absolutely refuse to run on Wine or Proton. Um, that's when you may have a weird situation where you have your Linux computer and it's got a partition installed with Linux, and so you have to make space and put a Windows partition on there too, if you're following what I'm saying so far. So what you're basically doing is bootloading, but you have Linux as your primary system, and you kind of install Windows as the fallback, or an alternate system. What I have to advise, if you have Linux as your primary system, and you either need to make space or have existing space for a Windows subsystem, like a Windows secondary system, if you're making like two partitions on the same drive, be prepared for a few problems. The most obvious problem is when you install Windows alongside Linux, Windows kind of forces its first boot priority on you. So you have to know how to manipulate the BIOS's booting system so you can still get into Linux. What usually fixes this is after you've done a Windows install, you opt to have the boot order changed, and you go into the BIOS, you force Linux to the top, and the Windows subsystem doesn't automatically load. And assuming you're using something like Grub, which is usually easier for multi-boot systems, you can just update, I would highly recommend just reinstalling Grub at that point, and it will usually help refresh and fix the boot order, and it allows you to boot into the Windows system as well, as long as you have something like a OS Prober installed with it. So that's generally how you fix. That was actually one of the smaller problems I had with my unusual setup, and I noticed that very few people had that problem because, most people would have a way to maybe resize Windows and install Linux, or maybe they didn't use all of the drive in the first place for Windows. They realized they wanted a dual boot system, and they somehow found a way to specifically install Windows to a certain size, and then they installed Linux underneath. I had the exact opposite problem as I just described. Linux first, and then I had to install Windows later when I realized there were certain programs I could not use. I've also been using it for testing the Windows version of programs I've been developing, so, Another really huge problem with trying to do things this way is maybe you have a faulty boot stick, like a faulty operating stick, like a USB, and you try to use it and it keeps giving you major errors because it didn't flash to the drive correctly or something. It can be extremely difficult to flash Windows to a system without if you're not using something like Rufus. I don't know what it is about Windows systems, but you have to break down certain files so that they'll fit on what's called a FAT32 system. Basically, a FAT32 system is just a very specifically designed system. It's usually regards bootloaders and specialized file types. Um, if you've ever heard of something like EFI and booting, you know what a FAT32 is. Um, but basically, you have to format an entire USB stick that way, and then you have to have the right program to add your Windows ISO to it. And I think this goes for every version of Windows that you can think of, depending on how far back you go. You need to make sure it's FAT32. You need to make sure that you're using the right program for the job, because if you don't, it's either not going to boot into the stick, or it'll get far into the installation, break part of the way there, and then you can't use it anyway, which creates even more problems. Here's the last, and perhaps I would dare say biggest problem with an unusual Linux plus Windows setup where Linux is first. If you're lucky enough to have installed your Linux system well, but you decided that you want to make space for for a Windows system or even another Linux distro, you have to make sure that you're using the right tool for the job. In my case, I usually depend on gparted pretty heavily, but it can be dangerous because if you have an unusual setup like the way Debian installs things, you'll have your system install something like your swap partition to the end of the drive. So it'll fill up the entire thing with a Linux file system, and then it'll tag on like a small swap drive to the end. And I really didn't want to find out what would happen if I moved the system around in the sectors for the swap drive. So I manually deleted the swap drive through an installation process. You never do this while your system's running live, please. And then I had to manually resize the file system to the unused parts. From there on was just when you resize a file system using something like gparted, if you're just like clicking and dragging, trying to figure out the right allocation size for like a whole new system, whatever you do it in small amounts. Do it at like a few gigabytes at a time, maybe 50 at max. If you do anywhere from 100 to 200 gigabytes of resizing from the end, basically just shrinking the file system to a smaller amount than what you had, it's going to take a while for Linux to register that those sectors need to be moved, even if there's nothing important on them. And it's going to take a while to trim it and free up that space and allow you to use the new space. And this is especially true if you're using several gigabytes. If you're using like at least 500 gigabytes for a new system, you do not want to do all 500 gigabytes all at once. It'll take all day for that system to adjust. The last and really important thing I have to say is, if you think there's even a chance that you want to do a Linux and Windows system, make sure you've done a lot of research and know what you're doing ahead of time, because the alternative is usually destroying your system and having to reinstall everything from the beginning. And that is not a problem that anybody wants to have. I've had multiple cases where I was trying to set up a system, made the wrong decision somewhere, and bricked the whole system, and I realized I had to basically reinstall it. It is relatively hard to break Linux if you're not tampering with system files, but it is not impossible. Then it comes down to once you start installing Windows, like I said, just make sure you have your bootable drive ready. Make sure you do not select any occupied space. If it says there's unoccupied, unallocated space, that's what you want to use. And these tips are specifically for people installing Windows as the underlayer to the system. There was also one more niche problem I had, which I said like before. When I had to delete the swap partition for Debian because it was placed in an unusual spot and I didn't want to wreck the sectors on my Linux system, I used an Arch Linux stick to basically boot into an Arch Linux system and go in and manually unassign the swap partition and delete that partition. Then I resized the system. Then once the system was resized to where I needed it to be, I made sure to use like a tool like cfdisk or fdisk or whatever to create a new swap partition. I made sure to set the file system type to the swap, and uh, the part that was difficult to figure out is I had to figure out the block ID for the swap system. I had to copy that information to the FS tab on the Debian system. And I really don't recommend doing this unless you know exactly what you're doing, because FSTab is a really sensitive file. But if you do know what you're doing, and you replace the old swap drive data with the new swap drive data, and don't alter anything else, all you really need is the UUID. Just copy and paste it over the old one, and it should load in fine. That's actually the system I'm on right now. I realize usually these styles of videos are very unscripted. I'm saying as much as I can from memory and previous notes, but really, the advice is still, I want to believe it's pretty sound advice. If there are any Linux experts that think I've seriously messed up on what I'm saying, if they think I've been doing it wrong, that's fine. Just tell me what you think what advice was bad. And obviously, I would not recommend doing any of this unless you're already fairly familiar with both Linux and to an extent Windows, because dual booting is a bit different than using either one or the other system. You are setting up a computer to be able to switch interchangeably between both, and that can be difficult, and it's only becoming more difficult as Windows systems move into 11 and so forth. So just be cautious. Make backups of everything you know you can't afford to lose before you make any major system changes. And that's it.